You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the Democratic Press Conference. I myself is Representative Spence Hawley, the Minority Leader of the House, and I have with me today Senator Jason Frerichs. Senator Billy Sutton was sick today and unable to make it. Jason is a former Minority Leader, so he's quite used to doing these anyhow. So we'll just make a few brief comments and probably just open it up then for questions. We're into the fourth week of session. We're looking just ahead of time. I see we've got about 529 bills introduced this year. And yesterday was the last day for legislators to introduce bills, so we know what we have. A lot of our committees are heading into heavy work overload. I know in State Affairs Committee we've got 30-some House bills and another 10 resolutions we need to do before crossover days. So it's really going to get quite intensive the next couple of weeks here. Our focus has still been on the workforce development discussion. A lot of the bills that have been introduced on our side have been from the workforce development and what we can do to help the average working family. We've talked repeatedly here about the Building South Dakota program and the Housing Opportunity Fund and what we want to do and the intent to expand that. A lot of our discussion, though, is going to revolve down to the very end when we get down to the revenue and the expenditures. As you know, I think it's the 14th of February, they will set the revenue for this 2019 budget. I've heard optimistic news. We know the November numbers were up a little bit over the governor's budget address, and we're anticipating that the December numbers are going to be better after Christmas sales. So we'll know a little bit better, and a lot of that will flesh out then what is available for extra funding that we can direct. From our side, we would be pushing for the K-12, that they get some kind of increase. The second one is we will be pushing for the state employees at to get off of the second year in a row that they've had no pay raise. So those are major priorities. And then finally, the Board of Regents discussion. We need to help the Board of Regents in whatever way we can. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Frerichs and let him talk about the Senate side.
Well, thank you for that, Leader Hawley. It's fun to be back here in the press conference room and to be with all of you folks. Again, Senator Jason Frerichs from Wilmot. And I'll just mention a few more of the areas, especially on the open government. That's a theme that, aside from workforce development, open government is another important facet of our Democratic legislative priorities. And so, just a couple bills, and the first one, Senate Bill 133, deals with the record retention so that we can ensure that all government agencies will keep their records for at least 10 years. And we know as taxpayers, and certainly right now when it's income tax time, we know the importance of keeping our records. And in this case, why shouldn't our state government at least keep them for 10 years should there be any issues down the road? Another bill that it's not a Democratic bill, but it's something that we as Democrats supported, was brought to us by Senator Rush, and we just passed it on the floor yesterday, is Senate Bill 84. And this requires the disclosure of settlement deals with settlement deals throughout all government levels, basically, but especially in terms of state government. So if they make a deal with someone, that it's disclosed. And obviously what Senator Rush talked about, if the, luckily, to our knowledge, hopefully this hasn't happened, but you look at other states where there's been certain settlements reached, especially that he gave the example in Minnesota. Perhaps he was in the executive branch even, where they had some harassment issues that were settled, and it's serious dollars that were involved, and so to have the knowledge of that disclosed is important. And lastly, Leader Hawley mentioned, of course, in the workforce development, and he's been very involved. Both him and I helped out on the Building South Dakota program, and we as Democrats have a bill to at least get $5 million from the Futures Fund to continue to give that much-needed help to Building South Dakota. We know housing, workforce development, very important for our communities out there in South Dakota. With that, we look forward to the questions and any discussion. Thank you.
Throw it open for questions.
There are a number of bills that are aimed at the initiative and referendum and even constitutional amendment process. Are there some that you're concerned about, and why?
Well, and I think we've talked about that at our very first conference here with all the concerns, because there's a ton of bills this year to limit the initiative measure process and the referred measure process. And you know, we can go through on both sides of the houses. There's several bills out there that try to restrict it, and basically we oppose those restrictions. We think that the initiative process for South Dakota is a good process. Does it create some problems sometimes with the bills that we have? Yes, it does. But I do not think that we should limit the people's ability to put something on the ballot. And as the referendum process discussion, I think that individuals should be allowed to refer a bill from the state of South Dakota, that legislatures pass up here at the state, that should be brought back. You know, we had and I'll be wrong, I believe it was 1005, and y'all can correct me on the bill that was talking about the votes on how we vote, and we had a big discussion on a simple, they were changing the process on a referred law, the yes is no and no is yes discussion. And there was agreement to move it back to the process that it was before. And so those are things that we just need to make sure that it's clear to the public when they're voting, and we need to allow that process. Specifically, there's a bill coming on the constitutional that I believe is unconstitutional, that we have to approve them from the legislature. And I just do not support any of those types of overreach of the legislature.
Well, absolutely. There's already mistrust out there from the citizens as far as, you know, wondering if we as elected officials are trying to exercise too much power. And so anytime that power is taken away from the people out there that are proud to have that right to initiate ideas and initiate measures or initiate constitutional amendments, we need to protect that. And so as Democrats, we will join with our Republican colleagues that agree with us to fight back on those attempts. You know, two areas that are really important and that have some traction, at least the one, the 55% vote on constitutional amendments. I mean, that's a big change, and that certainly takes away power from the people. And so we tried to, you know, defeat that bill. It passed in the Senate. I'm not sure it's over in the House side now. But then the other one that would prohibit citizens from initiating constitutional amendments. We're strongly opposed to that.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that. That House Joint Resolution 7, I think it is, that does eliminate that ability for the citizens to initiate a constitutional amendment. I spoke with Speaker Mickelson about that bill, and he said, you know, it's kind of in response to, you know, some of these laws like Marcy's Law passing that he says isn't really working for the state. And he said that, you know, they want to protect the 49% minority from the 51% majority who might have gotten it wrong. I guess, could you address that?
Sure, I understand what you're saying there, Lee. You know, and that's, again, that's the problem with looking at these initiative measures or constitutional amendments. We can't try to guess what's in the minds of the public. We have to take at face value, and we know that our voters out there do have the chance to examine their ballot and make a decision one way or the other. And so to think that people didn't know what they're voting on or to question the intent, that's wrong. And we can't do anything but take at face value. And if the concerns are out-of-state interests or anyone else, that should only embolden us here as South Dakotans. You know, we're what do we have, around 800-some thousand people here that we're we're almost kind of like a big family where we can look out for each other. And if we don't like what's happening, that's why we get involved and make a difference, and then push back on those attempts. So again, we need to keep it simple enough and obviously follow the process that has worked and kept our state very strong to this point.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate what Jason said, that we would just totally oppose any change to limit that constitutional amendment by the people, that they could not do it. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a few more. I know that another bill is to, I guess, for the voters to decide on whether or not to get rid of Marcy's Law, and then there are bills that put provisions of that law into state statute. Would you guys support the repealing of Marcy's Law and that statute change?
I had a discussion with Speaker Mickelson before the session. I know Marcy's Law is giving him a bunch of problems, and I understand that what the discussions are on some of the issues within Marcy Law, and if we can fix them by statute, I'd be supportive of that. Especially if it's created big problems at our county levels and at with law enforcement end of it. To totally repeal the Marcy's Law, I think is pretty difficult to turn around and do that after what we've done the last couple of sessions here with the people's vote.
Yeah, I'd agree. Are there any questions on the phone? We welcome the folks that are on the call.
I don't know if there is a phone, is there?
Yep.
Is there? Okay. Okay, is there any other questions at all? Here.
I guess just your impressions of the session so far here. We're 3-4 weeks in, roughly the halfway point. Anything standing out as different? Is it business as normal? Impressions so far?
From the House side, if I'm going to start, it's not really been business as normal. And again, we've alluded to this discussion before. There hasn't been a major overall initiative from the governor, which in my 8 years here, there's always been a major focal point for session, and we haven't had that. So it's really been a splintered session. A lot of bills introduced, as we've said, and not, huge minor policy changes in the bills. Just a lot of pulling this out in favorite areas that everybody's working on in there. And the dollar revenue discussion is the overhanging above us all. We're just kind of waiting to see, okay, now if we show in a couple weeks that we're going to be able to raise our revenue projections for next year and that we've got funds left over from this year, I think you'll see a feeding frenzy out there for everybody on their bills, trying to get them funded. But it is a different for me this session. I don't know about yourself.
Yeah, well, I would agree, and for Representative Hawley and myself, we both are term limited in our respective chambers. So we've been here for a number of years. We're probably more the seasoned lawmakers that are out here, and so we've had a chance to compare each year. I would say what's different this year is we didn't start off with the repeal of IM-22 discussion that really tainted last year's session. I think that set the tone, and that carried through for the entire session. At the same time, we know that we have good working relationships with our friends on the other side of the aisle, even last year, and I think this year it's even better because we know each other as people. We come out here, we leave our families and come here to do the people's work, and so I still think that there's a very healthy level of respect among lawmakers, all 105 of us. What I also will say, though, is what's interesting, all the focus on the initiative process, I think much of that is reflected even in the legislator bills, as Representative Hawley mentioned, 529 introduced. There's many ideas out there, and as lawmakers, we have the opportunity to bring those ideas here to the Capitol and see what's possible. And so as much as our citizens like that opportunity, we see the same for those of us that are elected officials. And so that's been refreshing. We're here to do work, and so let's be busy in our committees. Let's examine where there are issues. Certainly, there's never really an appetite to overhaul the entire system. It's making those small changes. I'll also add, though, aside from the general fund and the budget side there, where we do have some money to work with is more so on the highway fund side of things. That's very healthy. We passed Senate Bill 1 a few years ago, working really well, coming in above projections. And so my concern there, and my colleagues, not only as Democrats and Republicans, agree, we have to make sure that we don't starve our local governments too much, that if we can share some of those dollars from the state perspective and send that back to locals, we should look for ways to do that. And that's why I've brought a bill this year, I think it's Senate Bill 158, which would help bolster up that BIG program, which is a state program for local bridges.
I had one more question on House Bill 1140, which just came up in House State Affairs regarding provisions to access public water. And it has to do with township through roads. I know this has come up in your district, Senator Frerichs. And I believe the legislation added that no county or township may vacate a highway which provides access to public land or embracing an area not less than 40 acres of water that are open to the public for recreational use.
Yeah.
Does that concern you at all in your district, Senator Frerichs? And then,
Sure.
I'll give you a second there to think. We just passed that just half an hour ago up in State Affairs, and the discussion has been but right now they can't close it if there's public access or if there's public lands. They can't close the roads in there is the law currently, and it's simply added on or public waters, access to the public waters. And then it was just amended that access to public waters meant waters greater than 40 acres is what it is. And then it actually passed unanimously out of the State Affairs and is just going to the floor. Now, Jason will be able to respond because that will be a big issue up in his area.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is, and that's one thing we were in this last summer for our interim session, and Representative Hawley and I were both on the task force that looked at this issue in depth in terms of the public's access to these flooded lands. And it's a huge issue. Obviously, I know Lee, you've had a chance to interview many people that have been involved in this issue up in the Northeast, but it's certainly more than a Northeast issue, and that's one thing that I have appreciated, that lawmakers from across the state have asked to know more about the issue. And even though each of us will have our certain areas of the issue that we're going to probably stake our claim, I think that, and I'm refreshed to hear that at least there is discussion on how can we work better, because obviously there are questions on when these roads are vacated and if there is a need for the public to have access to the land or water that's beyond that point. Certainly that needs to be brought into consideration. At the same time, much of the reason why these local governments have asked to vacate roads is simply because it's easier for them to operate in terms of farming that land that may be around those bodies of water or anything else. But it's very contentious, and there's always going to be two sides to that issue. But we're going to keep working on it. I know on the Senate side we have a number of those bills that are dealing with the non-meandered water issue, and in committee and on the floor we will have some very much robust debate about what's going to be the best plan. From my standpoint, I'm most in favor of giving certainty out there to our sportsmen and women and the landowners so they know where they stand on the issue. And so I would be much more in favor of making sure we remove the sunset on the law that currently exists. And then if there are adjustments we can make, let's certainly look at those. Not close the book on it this session, and certainly not forget about it in the future.
From the House side, as you know, we've already passed out of the House the bill that removed the sunset and left the bill in, and I supported that. That was a great starting point. That being said, there are a lot of other bills out there. One thing that I've learned, and I probably come at it more from the sportsman side than Jason comes at it from the landowner side, is that the respect side to the landowner is a major factor in this. And somehow we need, as our discussions go through, as we push for open waters for sporting and fishing and all that, that we maintain the respect for the landowner and their land, and that somehow needs to stay in the process, because that to me was one thing that stuck out loud and clear this summer, that they feel that they were just being run over and showing no respect for their rights at all, and we don't want to have that happen either, so as we get together towards the end of session.
And that's very, very refreshing for me to hear that, because myself, yes, I am a landowner, but I'm not a landowner affected by this issue as far as flooded lands. But to hear a sportsman like Representative Hawley say that respect is first and foremost for those folks, it's awesome. So I think we're making headway, but there's always going to be outside of the legislature even that discussion that happens that we have to certainly be attentive to, but at the same time we're here to do our job and obviously give that certainty.
It's interesting how we get into issues from some of the previous discussion. This is not a partisanship issue discussion. It's not a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's just a broader issue for everybody to discuss, and we divide across party lines on every side of this. Any other questions at all? Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank
Have a
you
great
very
weekend.
much.
Morning, I'm Blake Kurd. I'm the South Dakota Republican Senate Majority Leader. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Good morning, Representative Lee Quam. I'm the House Majority Leader, and looking forward to your questions as well. We just as well get started.
Good morning. There have been about 20 bills filed that have to do with the initiated measure process, petitions circulating, et cetera. There are some who've been involved in that process that have called them an unprecedented attack on the initiated measure process. Can each of you speak to what sort of proposals you would support in that arena, in which you might say no to, which you think might move too far in that direction?
Well, we just had a bill in State Affairs this morning where originally it said you had to have your residential address, email, that type of thing. We took the residential address out. We figured that was a little too far reaching. I think the thought process is there's a lot of out-of-state people coming in and getting signatures, and that's really not how it's supposed to be done. It's supposed to be South Dakota residents that are doing it. Matter of fact, at the state fair, I had a gentleman from Omaha. He approached me. I asked him where he was from. He said, "Oh, I'm from Omaha." And he was not hesitant to say that. And he was just staying in a hotel room for a while to get signatures. And I think we just need a little more clarity on this, and I see nothing wrong with making sure that we have South Dakota residents doing it.
For me, I approach every option for changing the initiative process with some caution. I like to evaluate them all. Certainly there's a lot of interest because of the political activity over the last couple of years. And so I think whenever something like that bubbles to top of mind for so many individuals, you're going to see lots of attempts to adjust and modify. And I don't think any of the proposals that are out there are unworthy of discussion. I can't tell you at this point how many of them will survive, obviously, but I don't think that just because people bring things up to talk about them, that it rises to the level of an attack or a threat. So the opportunity to have discussions about our initiated measure process, I think, are certainly valid and worth the time, energy, and expense of the legislature. As you know, South Dakota was the first state to bring this process up. So if you had the same discussion back so long ago, you would say this is an unprecedented attack on our ability to initiate laws, and so you could have the same discussion then. So I don't think it's anything that the public should be fearful of. They should engage in a conversation and enjoy the deliberative process, and we'll see what survives at the end of the session.
The question was about the many measures that have been brought forth regarding the initiated measure process.
Sure. Well, as the other two have said, I think in my approach, a lot of my constituents have asked if there's any way we can provide some more clarity through the process. And I think that's when I'm looking at this. I'm looking at things that can offer some clarity. For example, House Bill 1005 was the recitation bill. It's over into the Senate now, but I think it's trying to make some things more clear and concise as people are heading into the ballot box. Things along those lines, I think, are certainly worthy of a closer look, and the rest is up to the people to decide in the legislature, and we'll see what happens.
Just one thing rises to the top of mind for me, Dana. I think if you look at some of the proposals that have been put forward, such as applying the process to putting a fiscal cost on initiated measures that have one. So the folks that are large proponents of open government and transparency reject almost out of hand applying the same openness and transparency to the initiative measure process. It seems like a dichotomy. I don't know what they're afraid of. If we're looking at a potential change to state law through the IM process that costs millions and millions of dollars, what's wrong with the public knowing that? We certainly get the possibility to debate it here in the legislature, and it's a little bit of an overused metaphor, but it's a goose and gander situation, I think. If it's good for us to know, it's good for us to know, and the public ought to know as well.
Yeah, I would certainly concur with what's been said, and my constituents, when they talk about it, they said, there's so much information that we don't have, and it's really hard. The AG can only have 200 words to talk about a 34-page piece of potential amendment, and that's very difficult to do. So I think if we can get them more information, the better. And these people shouldn't feel like we're going after them when we just ask for more information, just more clarity. I think it helps everybody do a better job when they make the vote.
Some of these proposals obviously come after last year in the 2016 election, when we saw a lot of out-of-state money come into the state to influence these elections. A couple of proposals that seem to have out-of-state influence tied to them. How do you balance restricting out-of-state interest on the ballot, but also allowing grassroots groups in the state to access it?
There's no one answer to that question, and I can't give you one. I think a large measure of this question has been answered by the Supreme Court, and that makes it difficult for us to do things that would try to trump or override that. I know the Speaker has a different opinion, but I think because of the Supreme Court decision about political speech, I think it makes it very difficult for us here to write state law that would attempt to override federal law.
I guess I would agree with the previous speaker. It's very difficult. You know, free speech allows anyone to do anything, basically. You know, you can't start limiting things. And we just need to be careful what we do. That we don't want to limit, but by the same token, we want to make things more open.
Well, I think it's a delicate balance between, you know, restriction and transparency. And, you know, and it's hard to kind of have both sometimes, so.
I know we're going to start getting some fiscal numbers in the next 2 weeks. Any sense of where budgets might be at and any change in priorities if it's good news?
Well, right now it's looking like the numbers could be getting a little better. I mean, that's a report we have. We haven't actually seen any numbers yet, but that's kind of the perception, is that it's going to be a little better. And I'm not going to say any priorities change until we see what it is. It's, you know, we can have that discussion once we kind of have a better note. In a couple of weeks, we'll have a lot better idea where we're at, and then we can have the discussion, because I think everybody's got their priorities out there, and, you know, we'll just have to see what it is. At this point, we just don't know. But it does look a little better than what we were perceiving at first.
I think Lee's right. There's some cautious optimism in the economic forecast. I think you've seen that nationally. That exists here in South Dakota as well. We should have sales tax receipts from December available first part of next week, and then, as you mentioned, in February, the legislature will adopt a revenue estimate for fiscal 2019, and should have a much better look at what the rest of 2018 looks like. Some of that optimism is driven clearly by this significant congressional tax cut that was just passed at the end of last year, or just recently, excuse me. So I think that gives the folks that look at long-term economic forecasts some optimism. More money in the piggy bank at home means more in the economy, and I think it's a great step forward for the country, and I think we'll probably see that play out here in South Dakota as well to some degree. To how large a measure, I don't know yet, obviously, but time will tell. So cautiously optimistic, but probably not meteoric rise in revenues, at least at this point.
I think the wild card, you know, as usual in South Dakota, is our agriculture industry. The leader and myself live that every single day. We do have a fairly large supply of inventory sitting in our bins at home, and we have to work through that process as well, and you know, see what the rest of the world does for their crop as well this time of year down in South America. And so that's going to have an effect, and obviously we deal with weather here every growing season, and you never hope for a drought to help raise prices, because that's not good. So we need to continue to find ways to create demand within our agriculture industry, and hopefully that can help bring the tide up a little bit as well.
The Senate Judiciary Committee is set to consider a campus free speech bill today. Have any of you read it? Do you have any thoughts on that proposal at this time?
In general, I'm 100% supportive of people's right to freedom of speech, and if this bill in the Senate Judiciary helps to ensure that without restriction on college campuses, then I think it's a great step forward. We'll have to see what its final format is after it comes out of the committee. As you know, it's subject to amendment and changes, and so we'll have to see what the final format is. But in concept, in theory, I think I'm supportive, as is most of the GOP.
is actually going to be in House Judiciary. That's where I'm heading right after this. So we'll, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting debate to see, you know, kind of conceptually the idea, I think, makes a lot of sense. You know, as you get into the details of it, you know, as always, it's always open for interpretation. You know, a question I always ask in these is there a problem that we're trying to fix? Does this address the problem? And, you know, we'll see if that matches up.
I would certainly agree with what the assistant leader said, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. Is there a problem, and does this fix it? I know there's some places where I think we do have a problem. If this will help, I think that's fine. I think it's a good deal.
There were also a handful of bills filed yesterday. Well, generally there were more than that, as you well know, but a few that dealt with suspending refugee resettlement in South Dakota from certain countries listed on the president's travel ban list, and also bringing penalties for cities that would aim to become sanctuary cities for undocumented individuals. Do you have any thoughts on those proposals? Do you think it's important for the state to have sort of veto power over who comes into South Dakota?
I'll take a stab at it first. Immigration and refugee resettlement is a federal issue, and the state has very limited things that it can do towards that regard. That's been litigated at the Supreme Court level before. So our ability to kind of modify or attempt to take steps that would change what's already been established in law is going to be an extraordinarily difficult lift for us. I think the bills that would attempt to do that you reference are probably more of a political statement than a political reality. In concert with that, the resolution that calls on Congress to find the root cause of this terrorism battle that we're engaged in, I think is a reasonable step. And if our president and the State Department decides that there's too great a risk to accept refugees and immigrants from a certain area of the world because of the threat it poses to the country, I think our job here in South Dakota is to support the president and the Department of State in that decision.
I think there's some legitimate questions there. Obviously, on the immigration, the state is extremely limited in what we can do. That's federal policy. But I would concur as long as we can go with what the president and his staff, legislature, Congress decides what to do. You know, that's really where we have to go with it. For us to make a wholesale change in what we want to do, number one, I don't think we can, and number two, I think it would be a very bad idea to try.
There have also been 3 bills filed that specifically deal with signage near restrooms and or the teaching of gender identity in primary and secondary schools. Do you all have any thoughts about those proposals? Is that a topic the legislature should bring up again?
That hasn't risen to my desk to review those at this point, so I don't have comment today on those.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess I haven't seen those also. I know we had that discussion a couple of years ago with the idea being some of those issues are best handled on the local level. But obviously we will probably revisit them again here. So.
Yeah, I have not seen them, so I will reserve comment until I get a chance to read it and see what it says.
We're nearing a final total for bills. It's looking like it's over 500 at this point. Any thoughts about how you're going to get through all of it? What the next couple weeks are going to be like?
Well, as far as House State Affairs, we have already decided that on Tuesday after session and Wednesday after session, we are going to hold meetings just to get through. We don't want to wait till the end to get through bills, so we're just going to tackle it and get it done. We'll get it done. I alluded to, I think, last week that we may have to burn some midnight oil, and I think that's what's going to happen to get it all done.
Sure, and I serve on the House Judiciary Committee as well, which is probably also, with the State Affairs and Judiciary, probably the two highest bill volume committees we have. And I know we are going to continue in that committee as well to, you know, we have an extra, the nice part of that one, it comes up against the noon hour, so we can oftentimes run a little later if we want to. But I'm guessing there's going to be many potential committees that are going to be meeting beyond session just to process all of the bills.
One bill at a time.
You've spoken to this a little bit before, but what do you think is contributed to the higher volume this year?
Well, yeah, like I've said before, the governor in a final year of his term, no major initiative coming off a summer study led by the potential governor's office executive branch. It's an election year. People are trying to, you know, if there's any particular issue or idea that they're very passionate about, this is their opportunity to bring it forward and go back to their constituencies and say, you know, whether or not it passed or not, I at least tried to offer this amongst the other legislators. And so I think all of those kind of combine to affect our bill volume.
I really don't have anything to add. I mean, I would agree with everything that the assistant leader said. A lot of different reasons. I don't think there's one specific thing that's garnering more bills than the other. Everybody is just feeling that they need to, you know, they have a good reason for what they do and they want to see what happens.
For me, I think it's threefold. Number one, new folks more comfortable with how things work here in Pierre at the Capitol, and therefore more eager to engage than they might have been in their first year in service. Second variable is those that are term limited and leaving the legislature, looking at their last attempt to accomplish things that are important to them. And the third thing, we've alluded to it some here today, but it's people making political statements for other offices that they're attempting to seek and using the legislature as a soapbox for that purpose, instead of really concentrating and focusing on what's good law and good policy for people that live here.
Would you hope that some of those soapbox proposals maybe get tabled, or?
I think you'll see some of them not survive the legislative process for certain.
I mean, that's why we have the committee process. I mean, every bill that comes here gets a hearing, and that won't change whether we necessarily agree with the issue or not. You know, it's important to somebody, so our duty is to let the process work the way it's supposed to, and it usually does.
We should just have the Dana Ferguson press conference next week because no one else has questions. So.
Thank you all. I know you have 10 o'clocks to get to.
Thanks a bunch. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Good weekend.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges. Programming is made possible with your annual membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. Additional funding provided by...
Today, we're moving the prairie forward. For the farmers and manufacturers, you are our member owners. Together, we are re-energizing rural.
Every day, Janet is able to repel distributed denial of service attacks, rushing her server at 300 million meters per second. With her impressive 25-inch reach, she can access her keyboard 6% faster than other IT professionals, which helps. Plus, Janet's business is protected by SDN Communications' Managed DDoS Protection Services. Even IT pros up their game when they partner with SDN. Enjoy the uptime.
Missouri River Energy Services, a not-for-profit utility providing electricity and energy services to municipal utilities in South Dakota and throughout the region. More about Missouri River Energy Services at mrenergy.com.